Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in today's video I'll be showing you how I painted the Warcry Catacombs bridges. Welcome to my first Warcry painting video. In this video I'll go through the paint recipe and processes I use to paint my grimy metallic catacomb bridges. At the end, I'll put links in the description so you can get the paint recipe for free on my website, and also I'll put a link to all the paints I used so you can get up to 20% discount on the RRP. As I was painting, I tried some different combinations and techniques, and I'll show you the comparisons to give some variations you might like to use, and I hope this video will give you some ideas on how to paint your own Warcry Catacomb bridges. I'm super excited to get this terrain built and painted, so let's get on with it and paint some awesome terrain. The instructions are pretty straightforward, though there was one piece of the small cata terrain that the instructions didn't cover. I'll make a separate assembly video for that, and I'll also be making more painting videos for each piece of scenery too. Preparing the bridges, I cut them from the sprue, and where there are a few sprue attachments just a bit too close to those spikes, I cut them closer to the sprue itself. Then I had a bit more room to cut them neatly when it was removed. With all the sprue removed, I used my files to get rid of the worst of the marks left behind. As some of the attachments were amongst the sculpted areas, I was careful not to remove those details and went with the grooves and patterns. Finally, with a sharp blade, I scraped the areas and mould lines just to make them smooth and ready to paint. To prime the bridges, I used the Army Painter Black aerosol spray paint. It gave a really nice coat quite quickly and dried pretty fast too. Just to be sure, I left the bridges to dry overnight, but you don't need to. Also, with it being quite cold, I made sure I shook that can for 2 minutes and immersed it in hot water to bring up the temperature before using it. I also just squirted a little bit out of the can before I put it onto the terrain, just to make sure it came out nicely. Great, so once primed, my first step was to add the base coat. For this first coat, I used Lead Belcher by Citadel. I wanted to apply this with like a rough stipple effect, so I just used a cheap kid's painting brush to cover the bridge quickly. This wasn't a dry brush, so I left quite a lot of paint on the brush each time I loaded it. Although the shade would come later on, I thought it would look cool to leave some areas with just a thin covering, so some of that black came through slightly through the Lead Belcher. I made sure to go in all the crevices, the eye sockets, around the spiky bits, giving it a nice coat of Lead Belcher over the entire bridge. And there we go, the two bridges with their base coat of Lead Belcher, and I was really pleased how they turned out. With the first coat complete and dry, I used the Vallejo Silver for a first highlight. With a smaller brush, I did that same rough stippling technique, but this time I only went over the raised areas and edges where I thought the light would catch. I took a little bit of the paint off on the paper towel, but not too much. This isn't a real dry brush, it's more of a stippling effect I was looking for. But I took my time and kept building up those layers. You know, it's a lot easier to add it a little bit at a time than it is to take away, and I didn't want to cover up any mistakes, especially when I wasn't too familiar with how these paints were going to work out. I imagine those spiky bits and around the edges are going to catch a lot of the natural light as a highlight, so I made sure that each of those was well coated with this effect. Here you can see the difference the highlight is made between the bridge with the silver applied and without. With just these two silver paints stippled on, I was really impressed with the effect so far. Okay, now is the time to put a shade over the whole thing, and I wanted the skulls of the bridge to be kind of a brassy colour, but as I didn't have any flesh shade paints, I had to think of something else I could use. After a failed experiment with some matte medium and flesh Vallejo paint, I thought I'd try the Citadel contrast paints. Gilliman flesh worked really well. so I applied it all over the areas I wanted to have that brassy colour. I used it right out of the pot and applied it quite heavily to get a good coverage. Ending the brush strokes in the deeper recesses really helps the paint to pool in the shaded areas more, so I did that and also took care to spread the paint out on the larger, flatter surfaces. As I'm thinking about my terrain, I really like to come up with a few words that describe the atmosphere of the place I'm trying to create. Grimy, gross, mouldy, abandoned, hot, rusty. These words all conjure up specific images and the direction I want to go in for the Catacombs dungeons. I also think about my miniatures, their backgrounds and the narrative I want to explore with them. Who will be exploring this terrain? How will they interact with it? And what effect will they have on it physically? Thinking about the history of the location that the terrain is going to be set in is also a good way to really immerse yourself, and I love this part of the hobby. With a break in my daydreaming and the Guilliman flesh applied, I next got to work on those silver areas. For the silver coloured metal, I added an Agract earth shade to give a contrast between the two metals, but in all the excitement, I'm really sorry I didn't record it, but just add it quite liberally on those silver metals and spiky bits, and make sure it gets into the recesses just by finishing those brush strokes where you want more of it to shade, just like we did with the Guilliman flesh. With our first highlight and shade applied, next I moved on to the weathering. It's so cool to add some rust to these metals, and if I had the Rise of Rust dry brush paint I would definitely have used that, but you certainly don't need it. I had this bright orange Vallejo paint which I hope would do the job. With a smaller brush, I added some paint to a dry palette and took most of it off on a paper towel. For the dry palette, I just used the back of my plastic wet palette tub. But you could use anything, a plate, a tile, a plastic sheet, whatever you have. With this dry brush effect, it's really important to get it off on that paper towel as much as you can. And as it's a subtle effect, I didn't want it to go on too heavy, so I took my time and just added a tiny amount at first. I went in on all the rivets around the silver metal in the centre and on the edges and imagined where rust would build up in the corners, and where two parts of metal met each other I pictured water building up there, and over the years and decades that would just eat away. I think it's cool to think about your terrain and how characters would interact with it. If they are more likely to walk in the centre of the bridge, for example, then that area would not have as much mould, grime or rust as the shoes wear it away over time. But all that grime and filth would certainly build up in the crevices, and water would run off those smoother, flatter surfaces into the joints, causing them to decay. These bridges are really starting to come along nicely now, and I was really happy with the contrast between those two metals. Although it was quite subtle, it was working out just as I hoped. So as we're layering up these different techniques, we're really starting to get some nice textures with the paints, and it was time to add another highlight. This time I added a second highlight with Balthasar Gold. At this point I was a little nervous and didn't want to ruin all that work I'd done so far. So with a very dry brush and small amounts of paint, I started slowly and built up until I reached the effect I was looking for. Again I used my dry palette, then worked off most of the paint on a kitchen towel and dry brushed along those raised areas that would be naturally highlighted the most. As this is the first time I'd used these paints, and the first time I painted any Games Workshop scenery, I was a bit apprehensive to start, but the more I used these paints and the more I got stuck in, I started to get more and more comfortable and really started to enjoy the whole process. It's always scary putting paint on any blank canvas, especially when it's a new medium you haven't used before. Here's a comparison between the two bridges, and you can see that the highlight is quite gentle but enough to give a nice effect. This highlight on its own is not enough, so it's time to go for another highlight which is just a little bit brighter. This third highlight was with the Vallejo Gold, a brighter and more vibrant colour, and I hoped that would work nicely as the final touch on those brassy areas. Same again, dry palette, work off most of the paint on the kitchen towel and start gently and slowly adding more layers of dry brush until you're happy. You can always add more, but it'd be really difficult to take it away and cover up any mistakes at this stage. There we go, so just keep building it up, adding that highlight there until you're happy with the result. And that's that stage of the brassy areas finished now. I was really pleased with how that just finished it off. Could add a little bit more, but for me that was enough. Next is the silver highlight on those silver metalled areas, and I used a silver Vallejo paint for those highlights. Again, dry palette, work off the paint and build up the layers slowly. With these silver areas, I paid more attention to the spikes and raised areas and made sure I didn't hide too much of that rust effect. As the two layers of highlight and rust blended together, it worked really nicely and I was starting to get really pleased with the progress. Here you can see the comparison before and after that silver highlight on the two bridges, and it's really starting to look nice. Just like the rust on the silver metal, I wanted to include some weathering on the brass areas. I wanted a kind of old weathered look that you can see on bronze statues. And for this, it had to be the smoothly named Nihilak Oxide. This stuff looks awesome in the pot, such a vibrant colour, and I just want to spread it on everything. But the key here is just to chill out, be patient and do a little bit at a time. I didn't want to cover the whole area of the metal and have it completely like greened out by this turquoisey colour, so instead I took my time and built up in the recesses and areas where the characters hadn't walked on. On the teeth I added the paint all in a line in those little crevices, then used a kitchen towel and wiped downwards to fill the gaps more and give the effect that the weathering was running down the metal. Any places where two metals met, I added some more paint and thinned it out as it moved away. The temptation here really is to add lots, but I took my time, slowed down and just started to see how that paint was reacting. As it was another new product and technique for me, I wanted to see how it behaved on the other layers before I fully committed to it. Before covering the areas I wanted to, I did a test on a small area and left it to dry just to be safe. I also tried some different brushes to see how they worked, and for the finished bridges here, I used the Citadel brush that came in the starter set. I got some really nice fine brushes to use on my miniatures from Army Painter and acrylic art brushes recommended by other miniature painters, but here the detail wasn't so tiny and precise, so the starter brush was perfect. I think for terrain like this and the effects I'm using, cheap brushes work fine. For me, the terrain is going to act as a backdrop to my characters, and I want that terrain to look as good as I can get it, but I don't want it to take away from those awesome miniatures. I kept adding the Nihilak Oxide, making sure I got every little recess or crack where I thought it would build up. This was really starting to come alive and was adding to my narrative. Here you can see the two bridges before and after the Nihilak Oxide was applied. You may want to keep yours more metallic looking without that weathering, but for my grimy, mouldy dungeon, this is just what I wanted. There we go, 2 finished Warcry Catacombs bridges, and I have to say I was super happy with my first go at painting Games Workshop terrain. These paints were brilliant to use, and I can't wait to start on the other terrain pieces. I was worried starting out, but that's what makes starting a new project or hobby so cool. Go to where the fear is, test yourself, and that's where you'll often get the best rewards. I'll put some links in the description below to check out some amazing creators whose videos I binged on when thinking about painting my Warcry terrain. They really helped me, and I hope they'll help you too. I'll also put a link to my website where you can get the paint recipe for free on one of my blog posts. There'll be a list there with all the paints I used, with links to where you can buy them, up to 20% discount on the RRP. I'll also put that link of all the paints down in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.